change should look like as far as the gender norms are concerned. I'm going to stop here and maybe come back later if you have more questions, Sharmishta.
Thank you, Prerna. That was very interesting. And I think the example that you gave really resonated. But I'll now invite Ravi to talk a little bit on what the earlier two speakers have touched upon in terms of what do we measure and at what point do we measure, and where do we decide that, okay, here is where norm change is actually beginning, because it might have very subjective interpretations. So, Ravi, over to you. Ravi, you have to unmute, please.
Thank you. I said thank you so much, both Indrajit and Prerna for um, you know for giving such a nice uh, background this conversation, and Sharmishta for putting me on the spot on this. But I think I would like to retract a little bit and not talk about measurement of change at this point in time, but rather talk about the ecosystem of norms and try and see where exactly we think or we have experienced from our own um, data coming from various projects as to what matters most in translating some of the expectations of norms at the individual level, because norms eventually are about how one perceives these expectations and experiences in day-to-day lives, uh, and those perceptions and the subsequent behaviors are determined by uh, the extent to which I think I would be rewarded by adhering to this, or I would be pushed back or punished by if I don't adhere to that. And then I look around and see what is the kind of support system I have for my own choices, and therefore it's very important how I perceive these players who are impacting me and in what ways, and that has an implication for measurement also. Just to give you an example from both boys and girls programs, we often found and across rural, semi-urban and urban areas that a lot of the times even those boys who turn out to be gender equitable on some parameters and say it profoundly and also demonstrate their gender equitability in their day-to-day lives, go take a backseat or somehow retract when it comes to intervening when they see some kind of violence being perpetrated on girls by their own peers, and that bystander interventions often show us very very clearly that uh, how important can the reference group be to interpreting the implications of norms and expectation for men and boys, in demonstrating their public face versus their private faces, and the major struggle for those who are working in the area of norms is really to expose, and I'm using that word deliberately, this kind of double um, two faces of many men who don't want to come out of the closet to say that I am equitable and I'm ready to uh, put my face to that because of that pressure. And it creates an ambiguity. It creates a further vicious cycle of the change process that goes two step forward, one step back, or sometimes one step forward and two step back. Actually, we regress. We begin because we're silent. And the other example is very close to what Prerna was saying, the intergenerational. We have seen in our programs how 12 to 14 years of girls seem to be very aspirant about jobs and about going out, and they sky is the limit. They can do anything. But we move to 15 to 18 years, and the jobs and aspirations for educations begin to take a back seat, and marriage becomes, begins to take a priority. So the norms around, um, what they should be doing and how should begins to mix with who they see is doing what within the reference group. If many of their close peers are getting married and there's a pressure and they feel that that's one thing to do, and there are varied experiences, then the girls' aspirations about education and work begins to take a back seat, and aspirations of compromising, adhering to these norms, expectations take a front seat. And most programs don't really address this kind of uh, this kind of ecosystem approach to create a support system where the girls who really want to challenge this also get that kind of a support. Many of them would cross the boundary if there is support system. That's why we say it is a structural issue in that sense. Although the norms as experience is an individual experience of perception and expectations, but the solution of that comes from the structural support to changing this. And I think in both measurement and programs, we need to have a combined approach of both what we think is right versus what needs to be, what these boys and girls and men and boys think, and women think is right. So and that's where I think the just before just half a minute to talk, to emphasize the issue of intersectionality, because this is such critical point that Prerna made. Because if at what age I am, in what caste I am born, with what kind of class I am having, what kind of support system I have, really determines how much that norm is making an impact on me. So intersection between my sex and my caste and my class, and my disabilities or abilities do become such important factors, on my sexual identities and sexual preferences. Of course, we'll come to that in detail at some point. But I think in the range of drivers that create marginalization, they create exclusion, they intersect with the sex of an individual, and they create a ecosystem of gender, and that is something that um, is a bit complex to measure, but it is something a lot of progress has been done on this. I'll not go on that, but I just wanted to put that perspective with those examples. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you. I'm particularly interested in taking the discussion a little deeper into something that Ravi said around how the ecosystem of norms itself changes with time. He gave an example of the children growing up to become adolescents, and how their reference group and how their aspirations play a role in actually what their ecosystem of norms looks like at different points in time. And I do have the advantage of knowing some of the work that Sapna has been involved in, which is particularly very relevant, especially in the context of adolescence and norm change. So Sapna, do you want to reflect a little bit on the larger ambit of ecosystem of norms, and maybe share a few examples from your work?
Yeah. I was actually thinking and I was listening, and while preparing a little bit for this talk, I was reading a little bit about norms, and I almost want to say in a very melodramatic way that a conversation on norms, or when you read up on norms, or when you hear people talk about norms, it's almost philosophical, right? Because norms are all pervasive, right? We live, whether we talk about our research, whether we talk about social sciences, when we talk about how others behave, we talk about norms, but also the standards that we force ourselves very often to live up to, right? So norms are very overwhelming. norms are very compulsive, and norms make it extremely difficult to actually pinpoint that these are norms, right? So that's why it becomes very complex. So talking a little bit about ecosystem of norms, I think, Indrajit, Prerna, Ravi spoke a little bit about some of the um, uh, issues, but I think one thing that has really stood out in some of the work that we've been doing in Maharashtra, in Pune, on convergence, public policy convergence and gender. I think one example always stands out for me when we talk about norms is that I remember we were talking to some government officials about women's participation in Gram Sabhas, and we were talking to some panchayati officials, we were talking to the sarpanch, and they said that, oh, of course, women don't talk in these gram sabhas, no matter how much we tell them that, speak up, they won't talk. And then they all believe that the platform is there. They all believe that, oh, the gram sabha is for everyone, so it's the women, it falls on the women that they don't talk. And then we went to speak to the women and to find out, and we spoke to women from um, different kasbahs within the village, right? Because like Indrajit mentioned, contextuality is very important. And even Prerna, how she mentioned about reference groups within a larger group. So we wanted our questionnaire and our research to be more representative. So we spoke to different women from different parts of the village. And all the women said that, once or twice when we've tried to speak, or some other woman has tried to speak in the Gram Sabha, there's been taunting, there's been ki, oh you're becoming like a male, right? Why are you speaking up in the meeting? So the women's perspective, from the men's perspective, the norm is that women don't talk despite giving the platform. And from the women's perspective and their lived experiences, when they are talking, they are considered to be very manly. They are considered to not be suitable to the context, and they've literally, in very different polite words, asked to keep quiet, right? So when you study norms, I think the point that I want to make is that we have to be very careful about where individual attitudes, we start assuming that individual attitudes are becoming norms, right? Or we start considering individual attitudes as norms. We have to be careful. So very often during research, there is a risk of considering individual attitudes as norms. So that's why this whole ecosystem is very important. You speak to the individual, you speak to their community, you speak to you take into context the political economy of that whole place, you take into context what's happening globally on that issue. And I think one thing very interesting in our project was that in the whole ecosystem of norms, and what we also discovered is that the material aspect, yeah, like Ravi was talking about intersectionality of class, caste, the material aspect also plays such an important aspect in determining norms, or at least in what people presume is the norm. For example, a lot of the girls in the areas that we were doing our research in the tribal belt, uh, don't go to school. So there is an assumption that, okay, the gender norms are such that girls' education is restricted, right? Upon conversation with parents, upon conversation with other people in the village, transport was the issue for the women and for the girls not going to school, right? So how are the material aspects around you contributing in shaping norms? That's another very important aspect that we must keep in mind while talking about ecosystems. So I will talk about this more as we go on, but as a researcher, I strongly believe in triangulation, right? So that's why when you talk about norms, I think you cannot just talk about individual level. You have to talk about society, you have to talk about structures, you have to talk about global, and you have to talk, I think a learning for me has been on the material aspect of it.
Thank you so much, Sapna. And that also provides a great segue to the next agenda that we wanted to touch upon today. So, like most of you have said so far, and it came up more strongly in Sapna's narrative, I feel, is a question around positionality of individuals, various structures, and how do we look at them given our own perceptions and our own location as researchers within this larger sort of a gendered reality that we are navigating on a daily basis. So, this is more a question, I would say, around reflexivity that we talk about in research. So how do we think our own personal experiences, our own biases, maybe what we would like to see and hear, determine our take on research as well as on the researched, and how do we deal with this within the context of gender norms research. So I would turn first this time to Prerna to begin the conversation. And again, we have the same 3 to 4 minutes time for each of the speakers.
Thank you, Sharmishta. Thank you for raising this very relevant question. And I think as a researcher who has been using mixed methods, I kind of go back to also my own training where when you learn qualitative research, reflexivity of the as a researcher is a very, very important aspect that you're taught about time and again. And I think that is where my consciousness as a researcher comes in from. Having said that, I think one of the biggest fears that I face as a researcher is what is it that I'm assuming when I'm bringing in my own understanding of norms to a specific program or to even measurement. So while, and I think Sapna gave a very interesting example of while, we may believe that the society or the community is not willing to send girls to school, it may actually not be so much about the community not willing to send, but about other things. And I think that's where getting into the nuances become all the more important rather than even going by what the community is sharing. And I think the point that Ravi made about understanding it in greater depth. So for instance, and I can narrate this example, when we were talking to some of the community members, some women were also present in that group. And we said, why is it that girls don't go to school? Because girls don't want to go to school. We have got them admission in school, but they don't want to. They're enrolled. And this was very intriguing, that how is it that girls don't want to go? So when we started talking, we realized there were just so many layers to that conversation. One of those starting point was that girls don't want to go to school because they get delayed and they don't have their own cycles, unlike boys. So of course, it's a transport issue. But when you really start digging deeper, you realize that girls also don't go to school in time, not just because they don't have a cycle, but because they are expected to do a whole lot of household work before they leave the house, unlike their male counterparts. And that is where, I think as a researcher, it becomes very critical for us to keep asking the whys for everything rather than assuming. Now, if I was to reflect on my own positionality, despite the fact that I fear I might be sounding repetitive, again, I think it becomes extremely important for me not just to recognize what my gender is, but also to recognize my own class. And especially when we go into the communities as outsiders, the whole outsider insider debate and how, I think Indrajit spoke about how people want to be seen or want to give responses is equally important for us to keep in mind and be very conscious of. Having said that, I think I will go back again to the point of when we are looking at, so of course, as a qualitative researcher, you are expected to write a note for yourself before you really start engaging in analysis. I'm not sure how many of us are really able to do that with the kind of timelines that we work with, but certainly a good practice. But when we really look at quantitative measurement, often we start, with the idea of looking at standardized scales, looking at standardized measurements, and then contextualizing them. Of course, there's a lot of work that goes into contextualizing, but I think it's very important for us to also understand that each of those statements that come with even the standardized scales have certain assumptions built into it. And I think it's very important for us as researchers to reflect on each of the assumptions that the scales or the measurement or the questions that we are even posing have, because sometimes we believe that the question is objective, but we forget that there's a lot of subjectivity that we bring in as researchers. I'm going to stop there. Happy to answer any other question.
Thank you, Prerna. That was a very interesting narration of how you have gone into your own journey as a researcher, and how different pressures also sometimes lead us to compromise on small bits of reflexive action that we can take as researchers. But I would want to go back to Sapna for a bit, and just request her if she has any reflections in terms of how Prerna took the conversation forward from where you had left off. I think it's become a very interesting take on the topic. So, Sapna, on reflexivity and your own work and experiences.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, as a researcher, I think the challenge is on the challenge is about being very effective, like being a good researcher, probing enough, being patient, not asking leading questions, and so on and so forth, right? And letting the story sort of reveal itself, yet at the same time being efficient, right? We all know that we have a consent process. We know our tools can be very long, right? So as a researcher, in terms of my own experience, in terms of my own positionality, I have often struggled with being effective and at the same time being efficient. So very often I remember we were doing this research in UP, and you're almost asking the same questionnaire on family planning, on health equity, to so many women after women, and then some interviews go on for 2.5 hours, and some interviews finish in 40-45 hours, right? 40-45 minutes, sorry, not hours. So the thing is that what happens is that the the way the interview is conducted, the researcher, at least I, initially had the habit of forming an opinion about that interview, and that would seep into my analysis, right? So that detachment is just, it's so challenging, and that is an area that as a researcher I very often struggle with. And what has helped me is that as a practice, in a research team, we always debrief, right? And sometimes, I don't know, perhaps at the risk of, I don't know, violating ethics, perhaps, I don't know, very often in the course of research, in the course of um, um, talking to a participant, a research participant, uh, I want to clear my biases as a researcher. So, for example, we were doing a study on premarital abortions, and this was when I was slightly more younger and a little less experienced. So, and my work on men and masculinities was very preliminary, and this study was on male engagement in premarital abortion. And you have this notion of young men, you have these experiences that you've had in school, your friends, you read, etc. So you think of young men as irresponsible sexual partners or predators, right? So, and that's what even came out in our study when we were doing focus group discussions. When you ask people about young men, they think of them as sexual predators. But in our study, we also had in-depth interviews where we are talking to young men who've been partners with their partners in abortion. So they've taken them for abortion, or maybe some of them have not. And we're getting their perspective. And to hear a young man say that I felt very guilty in not being able to take my partner for an abortion, or I felt very guilty in putting my partner to that position, in that position was very hard for me as a researcher, because I was like, why didn't you use protect? Why didn't you use protection then? In my head, that's the first thing, right? Because, but to then hear about his feelings, to hear about his guilt, to hear about how young men then compensate was very interesting. So that research study actually was very challenging in terms of fighting my own biases. And what helped that time were two things. One, talking to the participant indirectly during the course of the interview about your biases. So forming your own bias as a question, but this is the case or that is the case. And the other is that usually you're with a note taker, and then you have few teams going for different interviews. So then debriefing and talking about, oh, this is my sense, this is what I feel. So that those two things have been very helpful. But because we are also all conditioned, I think our own conditioning as researchers really comes in the way. So that detachment is very hard, and it would be very interesting to hear from others on that as well.
Thank you, Sapna, for the for a very honest account. I know most of us struggle with these issues, but we seldom get the time and space to come together and discuss some of these. So, moving on to Indrajit, I would like to ask, maybe take a step back and also request you to reflect on how the landscape and the conversations, like the discourses around researchers' own position, and how that plays into the work that we do. How do you think has that changed in your journey of all these years?
Yeah, no, thanks, Sharmishta, and Sapna's deliberation actually triggered a lot of thinking in me as well. Like when I'll not talk about qualitative studies because both Prerna and Sapna talked about it. I'll probably talk about some other kind of studies. I was doing ethnography in the beginning of my journey. So, and like being affected by the ecosystem is so common. Like when we, and as you stay there and you start staying more and more and more, you start getting affected, and your your thought process gets so much influenced by the ecosystem, as you are staying more in that ecosystem in which you are supposed to do a objective research, and your entire thought process continuously being getting a lot of subjective biases. And also, to start with, our we have our own belief about the issue always. Like when we go as a researcher, we have our own belief, and that belief is created on the basis of our own upbringing, where we are born and brought up, your own studies and everything. Like a lot of things actually influence us as an individual, and when a researcher is going there, they are going as an individual, and so this gets biased. So that is one issue, and both Prerna and Sapna talked about that issue. Another thing that makes a lot of difference is most of the time when we go and go with a very specific, very particular hypothesis in mind. In general, when we go to we go for a research, we don't go like a complete clean slate, going and seeing the area, etc. We have a research objective in mind, and that research objective, and my, before going into and jumping in the field, my previous reading, studying, etc., doing a lot of secondary literature review to understand how what has come out from other research, etc., actually creates a lot of bias in me when I'm actually entering into the field. So when I'm going into the field itself, I'm actually going with a lot of subjectivity. over there, and that actually many like are supposed to bias everything, including the our thinking around the methodology, tools, scales, everything gets biased. One more thing that I'd like to talk about, and specifically in quantitative studies that we find, and it is more of this thing, is the bias also by the data collectors or investigators bias, or the person who is actually asking the question. Even in quantitative studies, the way the question is asked, the expression in the face of the researcher, which actually triggers the respondents to respond in certain way. Like though they're reading the same thing, it actually goes like that. Probably one way of addressing that was like we tried in Bihar with this Akasi, like this color-coded audio computer assisted self-interviews. Some of those methods are there, which are technological, which can probably remove some of those kind of bias. But but bias is kind of very like one another thing that that's coming in my mind is very important to actually work on the or remove some of those bias, is to understand the like looking at it, as Ravi was telling in the previous discussion, about looking at it as a whole, understanding the issue in the whole dimension of the ecosystem, and understanding the interplays between different norms, understanding the social and political atmosphere as well, in which it is interplaying. Understanding that so I'll say three things that will help us removing the bias. One is, or maybe the four things. One is understanding the entire ecosystem, understanding the intersectionality between different norms, understanding the issue as a whole first. Number two, whenever we are going with one particular maybe hypothesis in mind, probably not like trying to reduce our focus on that particular hypothesis, and looking into the system as a whole. And also another thing, the third thing is probably trying to make yourself less affected by the ecosystem in when you are actually reaching there. Reaching there, trying to be less affected by that. So these are the few things which you can try to reduce the subjectivity that can come in through our own personal positionality.
Thank you, Indrajit. So I'll quickly move on to Ravi. And I also just want to make a note that we have almost hit the 1 hour mark. And we do have one more theme to cover. And there are a lot of interesting questions and reflections from the audience that I'm sure we are all very curious to hear towards the end. So Ravi, just going back to this question on reflexivity and what our colleagues have shared, and also particularly Indrajit's comments around bias and how we tend to get affected by the ecosystem where we are conducting the research itself. Any thoughts that are particularly coming to your mind that you would like to share with us?
Yeah, sure. Not any thought. There's so many, the flood of thoughts. But let me try and respect the time limit. I think as a researcher, there are two questions that have become part of my life as a professional life, and have become part of my personal life as well. One is, whenever I get the results, the first thing I ask myself, is there a different way to interpret this? There's one interpretation that comes with the results because we have used the theory of change, we have used the framework. But then I think once we get that, I ask a question to myself, is there a different way to interpret this? And second question that I always ask myself is, as a researcher, is there a different, could I have done it differently? This whole piece of research. These two questions are of paramount importance to me, and it has a legacy, it has a history. I am trained in psychology, hardcore clinical psychology as my specialization, and then went on to change my. I got disillusioned with that and changed to the to social psychology, and then I landed up teaching in a demographic institution, um, and learned about social demography. And I found that I'm already trading two different boundaries. One is very individualized conceptual approach to live human beings, and the other is an average human being. When the numbers begin to, begin to create average statistics on everything, and both have meaning. And it was only and both. So my first struggle was to combine these two conceptual frameworks. Uh, and I found there lots of conflict and lots of issues, and it's not so easy. And when I began to work on human sexuality during the time HIV, I discovered that there is another truth. Of course, one can never find what the ultimate truth is, but there is another piece of the jigsaw puzzle which I had not understood, is about um, you know this whole intersectional ideas of uh, breaking boundaries, human sexuality, going beyond the binaries. How culture, the political economy, I began to read sociological literature. I began to trade. I did a lot of work with my anthropologist colleagues to dig deeper into this. So I think it's a three-dimensional conceptual approaches as researchers that we need to keep. There could be fourth and fifth dimension as well, but I think so far in my growth process as a researcher, I think I always feel inadequate in saying that what I have found is the ultimate interpretation, unless my research tells me that yes, there is another way of doing it, and yes, there is another way to interpret, and that should become part of my repertoire of how I present those findings. It will remain top down. It will remain very disrespectful of the realities. It will remain unmindful of it will almost sound arrogance, if we say that that's the fact. Um, so I'll just stop because of the time. But I think the critical thinking as a researcher means that we navigate through these different conceptual approaches and try and find uh, both measurements and programs that are responsive to the people's realities. And this last half a second thing is that in that process, listening to people on the ground and checking your your facts with them and how they interpret in their reality is such a critical part of this critical thinking as a researcher, and constantly upgrade yourself. So I think we are all learning, we are all growing, and we are must learn from each other. We must learn from ourselves as well, by looking at our own work to see what I could have done it differently, and then create new boundaries. Yeah.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you. Um, that does beautifully tie up with the next topic that we wanted to discuss, which was more around the functional aspect of doing gender norms work, both in terms of research as well as practice. And by practice, I mean designing norm change interventions, unpacking gender and our understanding of gender while we are designing interventions, as well as studies, as well as measurements in the context of gender norms. So I want to ask our panel, how has this understanding, do you feel, has shifted? And more importantly, in the shifting of understanding of how are we unpacking gender in all of this, does that now include other stakeholders? Do you find it true find it to be true, sorry, in your work, that in measuring gender norms and gender norm change, other stakeholders are also important apart from a particular group that the intervention or research might be focusing on. So for instance, if an intervention is around women's economic empowerment, of course, the focus of resources and investment would be on women. But in terms of measuring what is changing around them, and again, going back to the entire question of ecosystem, who are the other stakeholders that we feel are now increasingly getting attention in this discourse? And to begin this conversation, I'm switching the pre-decided sort of order a little bit here. And I would like to go back to Indrajit to begin and then carry forward with others. Thank you. Indrajit.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that's a very important important thing to be discussed. One is when we talk about like, where do you go to measure gender norm? Do we go to include other stakeholders? Yes, that is very important. But we though like, I think more in most cases we don't focus on for example, when we talk about men and boys, and there are lots of intervention which are done on men and boys, and many of the social norms or gender norms specifically are being reinforced, practiced, and taken forward by men and boys. So I am doing some intervention on men and boys, but and like for in most of the time, our research and measurement are too heavy on understanding the norms, particularly from women, and not so much from the other constituencies. And like, I was just thinking when I was seeing this topic, I was thinking about our education research, when we actually have work with for example, we do teachers training, but we don't measure on teachers. We measure it on children in terms of the learning achievement. So similarly, when we are actually working on gender norm, we should measure it to other stakeholders, and not just particular stakeholders in terms of men and boys, but also to other institutions, and how much changes are happening in different institutions, that those are actually reinforcing different in specific norms. So that is one important aspect. Another important aspect at the same time is particularly deconstructing gender itself, like how much we are deconstructing, and how much should be deconstructed overall. Like for example, it came up earlier as well, like Sapna told very interestingly, looking into the material aspect of it when you were talking about norm and influencing norm. For example, when you talk about child marriage as a norm, and like we look into dowry, we look into dowry, and then you, at the end of it, you will find some economic and some economic relevance of the matter, the link of it with poverty, etc. So those are the things that needs to be looked into. When you deconstruct the norm, it does not only remain limited to that particular norm, it goes much beyond that. And as we have started with this ecosystem approach, when you look into the overall as a one norm in the whole ecosystem, and influence of different other norms on that particular norm, then it is important to measure all different norms to understand how those intersectionalities are actually working on that norm. So deconstructing gender or gender norm, or the norm in which we are wanting to measure itself, is an important aspect to be looked into.
Thank you, Indrajit, for raising very pertinent issues around deconstructing gender itself, and with that, even our own understanding or preconceived notions on how an intervention or research could be potentially taken forward. I'll invite Prerna for your comments on this next. And Prerna, again, at the risk of repeating my request, if you could again share a few examples from your recently completed work, which I feel will be very relevant here. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharmishta. So I think the points that Indrajit made are very relevant and give me a good segue into talking about how did we do it in our program. So if we were to talk about, say, an education or a program that is kind of situated in the education system, while we talk about stakeholders, I think it's also important that in that ecosystem, we start from the policy ecosystem itself. uh, what kind of norms does the policy really lay out for us? And starting from there, then coming down to school as an education system and school as a system in itself, as an institution, starting to really unpack gender norms there. What's very interesting for us was that because of the resources and the design of the study, while we did not measure quantitatively the gender norms and the perceptions of various stakeholders, we conducted a qualitative study with all our stakeholders, which included teachers, community members, parents, girls who were the focus of the intervention, their male peers, and even engaged with some of the government officials. What we find very interesting is that um, a lot of conversation that, for instance, we were having with teachers, and there is a greater understanding that teachers have very specific kind of, because they also come from the same communities, they also have a very gendered notions of what girls can do and what girls can't do and what kind of professions, or because this was a project specifically on employability, what kind of career options can they really choose for themselves. But I think it's also, and I'm again kind of sounding repetitive to myself, it's also located in this power play which comes because of the class differentials and the whole aspect of intersectionality which I was talking about. So the teachers tend to believe because these girls come from a certain background, therefore they should choose a certain kind of profession, which is again very gendered in its nature. Uh, and when you talk to that teacher about her own life and how what her children are doing, maybe it's a very different story. Maybe they're not talking about the same profession. So I think again there it becomes very important to unpack gender with, and how does it intersect with other factors. Having said that, I think it's as a researcher, and I'm just trying to connect the three topics in my head also. As a researcher, one has much greater power, and there is a power play there as well. So while you're going and conducting gender norms research, there is a certain power that you bring in as a researcher, and that also has impact on what you are able to unearth or what you are able to kind of really delve into. And I think we need to be again very conscious of that power play that happens between the researcher and the respondent. And therefore, what becomes absolutely critical for us to also remember that when we are measuring, what are we really measuring? Are we measuring only gender roles, or how gender roles have changed, or how gender responsibilities have changed, or how gendered attributes are looked at by the various stakeholders? So I think it's also important to unpack what do we mean by gender, and how do we pose those questions, and how do we integrate those different meanings that gender brings in. I know we are short on time, but I would just want to make one more point. One thing that, and I'm glad that we are having this discussion because I can be more critical of our own work and ourselves here, is the fact that often we do not, with our work with adolescents, especially I know of the program that we worked in Planet Girls, knowing pretty much that the education system does not allow you to talk about sexuality, we aren't really able to address some of those intersections. We aren't really able to address the needs of people who may want to express themselves, but we are not able to create that ecosystem for them, unfortunately, because we also want to work with the system, and there's some kind of dichotomy there. So while we try and integrate some bits and pieces within our curriculum and within our conversations, we also tread this very thin line and very cautiously to avoid any kind of major upheaval in the system itself. Yeah, I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prerna, for that last point. I know there have been a few observations and questions from the audience as well around this particularly. But quickly moving on, I'm requesting Sapna to come in and share her thoughts, and then to Ravi. Really sorry, but I'll have to request for short responses. We may be able to stretch a little bit, but I'm also mindful of people's time. So over to you, Sapna, and then to Ravi.
Thanks, Sharmishta. I think a lot of what I wanted to say has already come out, but one thing that I wanted to share about gender norms measurement, and something that I think I've struggled with, is that I often think that um, we must be very clear about what we want to achieve by gender norms measurement, right? Because right in the beginning, Indrajit spoke about contextuality of gender norms, contextuality of measurement. I feel that so often we are striving to develop standards, we are striving to develop scales, and then the process becomes reverse. Then we start using those scales to just sort of develop our project, right? Or develop our intervention. So I feel that we must be very clear that gender norms are very contextual. Gender norms, when you're working on gender norms, when you're measuring gender norms, I feel that aggregation of results, but it cannot be an aim. I feel like you have to work with disaggregated data. You have to work with keeping in mind that some norms are more applicable within certain reference groups within a larger whole, right? So I feel that's very important, because otherwise, um, as researchers, we have this sort of almost, we pressurize ourselves to almost prove our hypothesis, to come to a conclusion, to develop, to make our program sustainable, scalable, right? We have to talk about sustainability, scalability within a given context. It can be a small context, can be a small reference group. It doesn't have to be nationally applicable, state level applicable, or globally applicable. So I think because gender norms are social, but gender norms are also deeply personal, right? And how we integrate gender norms, how we challenge them, is also a very, very personal journey. And very often in the process of aggregation, we lose those nuances. So I would warn against that. And just one more thing I wanted to say is that, you know, gender gender norms becomes a scary word. The moment you talk about gender, it becomes a scary word, and people think that it doesn't have to do with us. So you shared an article around social norms and gender norms, right? We have to talk about the overlaps, and we have to talk about where perhaps we can be a little shrewd and talk about gender within the context of social, because sometimes using gender can be alienating. It shouldn't be, but unfortunately it is. So that is something that I think we have to be careful about. And in terms of other stakeholders, I feel like we have to do gender norm research with the private sector. I feel like we're missing that out. We're missing the corporate, we're missing the private sector. We do gender norm research on similar categories of participants. I think that is a missing link.
Thank you. I'm really, really glad that we are moving on to, the domain of a little bit of an uncomfortable conversations, which we don't get a lot of opportunity to do. So Ravi, over to you. Also, you are the last man standing for any overarching thoughts and comments. We'll just barely have time for questions, so I may not be able to come back for closing remarks. So over
All
to
right.
you.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be brief. I'll just give you an I'll begin with an example of a recent research project that we are doing extensively in 197 countries, tracking sex disaggregated data on various dimensions of COVID-19. It gathers data on a regular basis as to how many have been infected, what are the number of cases, how many died, how many hospitalized, got vaccines, and things like that, ICU and all. And then we are looking at which country reports these data by sex. And during the course of this particular work, so what it does, what it finds is that in some countries, more women are dying than men. In some countries, more men are dying than in a limited data set that we get. But we find very interesting variations how the biological theory around the infection and the fact that there is a biology of all the health system research established is superseded by the social construction of that sex, So in some context, the disadvantages of men are they're overcome by the society, by all the other practices that give them an advantage, more advantage than women. And in some context, the the women's advantages, that is biological advantages, are superseded by they become disadvantages, in fact. So and one has to really look at this data to realize that even the fundamental difference between sex and gender is not understood very well. I mean, let's not, even if you, let's forget about the whole complex idea of, intersectionality, and that would come as a natural fallout of this, because once you begin to deconstruct, you really get into that domain. But very often people use the word sex and gender so interchangeably. We who are working in the sector of gender perhaps don't take this for granted. We constantly maintain that, but there are a whole lot within the policy circles, bureaucracy, and people out there in general public who just constantly mix the boundaries between sex and gender. And that's why the researchers' responsibility to constantly emphasize that we need sex disaggregated data on everything that we talk about. And the moment we get sex disaggregated data, we begin to piece together the other pieces of data of, where these individuals are located, what are their caste, what are their class, what are their ages, what, abilities, disabilities. And as a result, then you construct a picture of social construction of gender. And I think nobody else but researchers who are truthful to the idea of advocating for gender as a centerpiece of most development programs in intersection with other marginalizing drivers have this responsibility much more than anyone. So we have a responsibility to really keep churning out this kind of data in everything that we do. We do a lot of youth research without disaggregating men and boys and girls. I mean, I've always wondered, the youth as a generic category people combine, which often does not even present data, sex disaggregated data. So I think we have to move, if we have to really move this agenda further, we have to constantly remind everyone through data that there's a difference between biological aspect, which is important, which has its own story to tell, but then there is a social construction which has another narrative which intervenes with other drivers of marginality. I think that's important part of both measurement and programs and researchers' responsibility. I'll just stop here because there's no time. I think that's, and because I just wanted to say, this really gives an idea that how fluid the concept of gender is, how non-binary the concept of gender is. This would immediately take you to the arena where we begin to really understand ourselves, that gender is a fluid concept. It's constantly changing, and it is it's a non-binary idea, you know. But then, first of all, we need to understand that the biological sex is different from my social construction. And that's pretty important for all of us to situate on the. We can't be average statistical human beings, you know. We can't be an average patient. We are a patient and individuals with a baggage of what my gender and what my where my position is in the society. So, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Very pertinent, Ravi. And um, that also leads me to some of the questions that we have around this from the audience. So there are two questions particularly that I feel fit very smoothly into where you left off. And I'm just going to read them aloud, and I'll invite any of the panelists who want to add, because I do feel that some of it Ravi already covered in what he spoke in the last few minutes. So one question is, how do we reflect the needs of the LGBTQI community within the dichotomy in which gender norms exist, and how do their needs get addressed? Another question is around, given the relevance of intersectionality, which may be beyond gender and sexual identities, and context of different groups and their experiences of gender norms, how do we measure and evaluate normative change? So anyone in particular wants to share their thoughts? Sapna, Prerna, Indrajit, or Ravi? I do feel like Ravi touched upon some of this in his last few minutes of conversation. Prerna, would you like to go back to some of the points that you
Sure.
mentioned around intersectionality earlier?
So I think I can take the question which one of our participants have asked around how do we really bring in the needs of LGBTQI community. And like I said, unfortunately, in most of our adolescent programs, while we try and um, build in some understanding around sexuality, we also tread a very thin line, because unfortunately our policy environment and social environment both does not necessarily allow for in-depth conversations on it with young people. And we've had times where we've had backlashes. I do remember in one of our past projects where a question was asked around pregnancy, and one of the girls went back home and reported it, and then there was a huge backlash from the community as to why are you asking questions around difficult areas. And I think, therefore, it becomes slightly tricky to be able to address the issues through our adolescent programming. However, I think now that I'm reflecting more actively on it, I think that we also need to figure out ways to even understand from young people, because we do realize, for instance, as part of Planet Girls, when we were conducting the session, we used to have this little question box during the sessions. And we realized there were questions around what is transgender, who are they, where do they come from? And that gave us a fair segue to really discuss it. And we could really say that, these are questions which have come from the students. But I think we need to more actively build the content around sexuality and different sexual identities, different gender identities, more actively into our programs. But again, with a caution that we will also have to constantly negotiate with the school as an education system, school and the education system overall. Maybe Ravi can add more to it. Ravi, Sapna, or
Thank you. Thank you. You know, very recently I was having a conversation with one of the interns at ICRW about making our programs more inclusive, right? And in the course of the discussion, you know, this whole dichotomy, I mean, between working on women and then including LGBTQIA issues is actually such a fake and unnatural dichotomy, right? So I think that the moment we acknowledge that this dichotomy should not exist, if you're working on gender equality, your programs should be working on LGBTQIA issues, because there's so much overlap. And there are differences, but there's so much overlap in the exclusion, there's so much overlap in the control, there's so much overlap in the kind of power that is exercised, right, over women and over LGBTQIA community. So the thing is that we must question the dichotomy in our work. And you know, very often we've had this discussion, and like Prerna also mentioned, the government does not agree. In Rajasthan, very recently, we had an experience where we included the word mardangi in our curriculum, and the government was uncomfortable, right? So you develop strategies. You don't write mardangi in the curriculum, and you use that example to train your stakeholders. And you say, oh, you know, we can't use the word mardangi because it's uncomfortable. So let's talk about why mardangi is uncomfortable, right? So in the trainings, we were asking teachers, why can't we use the word mardangi? What is your discomfort? Why do you think we were refused? So similarly, I feel like with LGBTQIA issues, I feel like we know the government is tough. We know our context is tough. I feel like we have to figure out a strategy for that, right? And that is where collaboration comes in. There are a lot of organizations that now focus and work on LGBTQIA issues, right? That we have to collaborate, we have to work with them and figure out what is the strategies that they are using. And we have to, I don't think now there is an option of saying that, oh, we cannot work on LGBTQIA issues, or we work only on women. I think that now it's time to push the envelope and to figure out what those strategies can be in collaboration. That's one thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sapna. I know we have almost, hit the clock in terms of the scheduled time for the session, but there are a couple of questions that I would quickly want to cover. There's one question around backlash to the work around gender norms. And the question asks basically in the context of gender norms work and how different groups may be at different stages of normative shift. How do we manage the backlash, and especially when we are working on scale? And I would request Indrajit and Ravi to take a couple of minutes to reflect on this, please.
Yeah, thanks, Sharmishta. Yes, I can take that question. Regarding backlash is an important consideration whenever we design a program, and in the gender norm or any other social norm shifting intervention generally has a possibility of backlash. For example, some of the programs that we are doing at the moment, like in one of the programs that we are doing specifically in Bihar, we have we are creating a group from the community, or I'm not going into the details of the program now, but creating a group in the community for fallback and kind of a fallback mechanism. If some backlash happens, then what is my fallback mechanism? To design that programmatically is important, and there are ways of doing that. And as a programmer, we need to be cognizant that there is a possibility of that, and how we can do that. For one of the adolescent program we have created, for example, created one community group with community women as a fallback mechanism for the adolescent girls if they face a backlash over there. And specifically, this program is a scale program, so that it was possible. It's possible at scale, but of course, any of this norm shifting program as such, or wherever we are working on the ground with the community, is a kind of a costly program. One of the most difficult ones to go to scale. One of the most difficult program to actually attract a lot of funding as well. And that's also very, very important. And I'm not. I thought that I'll speak it at one point in this today's conversation, but didn't get a specific scope to talk about it. But I think it's very important to really think of, like, possibly there are two kinds of programs. Like, programmatically, there are two types of programs in which these norms shifting interventions are used. One type of program which actually aims at changing the norm, and another which actually changes behaviors but really doesn't touch the norm. It is based on norm, but it finally changes some of the behavior. In the second kind of program, there is a better measurement, more objective measurement, because those are behavior change that gets measured, not the norm change. So there are better measures for that. For the first kind of programs where the target is to shift the norm, there are not many, like, measurement is intricate, problematic, as because of intersectionality, etc., etc. And what is happening because of that is that the return on investment of those kind of programs we are not being able to really understand what is the return of investment for those kind of programs, and donors are getting less interested in funding those programs. So until unless we solve this puzzle well, and it is very important to do it as a group, to solve this puzzle very well, to really attract more, even more attention, more funding, etc., into the entire social norm, gender norm space.
Thank you, Indrajit. Ravi?
Yeah, quickly. So my take is slightly different on this whole issue of backlash. I think we often get trapped into these terminologies and concepts that they sprung up for one reason or the other. Backlash, in my view, happens at multiple levels and has always been part of agenda programming, which is so contested. So I see that backlash happens at the organized level when it's kind of more political backlash for certain ideologies and all. So it requires one kind of step. But backlash will happen as part of the embedded, internalized reactions to some of the changes that are inherent, conflicting, because they're questioning the power is part of the game, as a part of the program that one has to account for. Those backlashes happen, and then the backlash happen within the individual. We are conflicted ourselves. We draw our boundaries. There's a limit to which I'll go and become equitable, each one of us, and then we'll take a back seat. So honestly, it's an introspecting game for us to, and very challenging. So backlash, and I'll give you an example for different programs that use different strategies to address this backlash. We have seen in our sports program of Mumbai slum communities working with low-income girls coming from very conservative families, where mothers used to strategize how to get their girls into sports program against the backlashes of brothers and fathers who were against sending girls into playing sports into Maidan or someplace. And mothers will have such a beautiful strategy to keep it disguised, keep it, provide different answers. And the program supported that kind of ideas. As people, as gender programmers who really want to transcend and transform these ideas, we need to hear those process of change, and where there is a resistance and what kind of resistance and what kind of support is done. So these programs have to be nimble. These programs have to constantly improvise. They can't be log frame based, activity oriented, and just do it and get the results. They constantly move the targets. So I would say that I would love to, and I love to work in programs that allow that kind of flexibility to improvise by looking at the nuances of backlashes, to address some of these issues by innovating newer ideas into the program and building them, and all that. So I think it's the whole issue of whole basket of backlash should not be considered as a monolithic kind of storyline there. There is sometimes some of the backlashes are in the nature of the programming itself that I would rather put my faith in, and use that as a yardstick to push the agenda of change by being innovative, by being creative. I think donors have to understand that rather than imposing a top-down framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ravi. Although there are definitely other interesting pointers and some questions in the chat box, we are almost 10 minutes over the scheduled time. So I'm requesting everyone, anyone who wants to strike a conversation, share something, ask for any particular resources, please feel free to write to us. We'll leave an email ID in the chat box. And thanks to all our panelists for the great conversation. I am, extending my special gratitude because of a lot of honest sharing that we could manage today. That was very refreshing, and I hope the audience also enjoyed the conversation as well as we did ourselves. And we are hosting another session on the 3rd of June. You'll find the details on the gLOCAL website. So please do join us for the next one as well. That will also include a greater number of voices and a very diverse panel as well. So I'm really looking forward to that. I invite you to come there. And thank you all the participants who have stayed beyond time. And with this, I'm closing the session. Have a good evening, everyone, and bye-bye.
Thank you,
Thank
Sharmishta.
you.
Great job.
Thank
Thank you
you,
so much.
Thank
Sharmishta.
you.
Thank you,
Bye bye.
everyone.
Thanks, audience, for being there.
Thanks. Bye.